Hello, and thank you for joining us this evening. Sorry to keep you waiting. We are starting now. So, my name is Bimpe Adeyemi, and I am the participation coordinator on the project on the Bishop of London, um, looking at the role of Bishop of London in the creation and development of slave societies in the English colonies across the Atlantic. So, just a bit of background into our project. So, in 2001, Fulham Palace commissioned a detailed research project to explore the role of the Bishop of London in colonialism and transatlantic slavery. The research has then informed our decision to work with and empower people who are descended from those who were enslaved or endangered to shape and lead on the project. Um, we worked with artists, partners within the communities to develop the research further and to draw out themes, which we'll be exploring later on today in our talk. This is our second lecture series that accompanies our current exhibition on the Bishop of London, Colonialism and Transatlantic Slavery, which is now open to the public to visit. The focus of the exhibition is looking at the systems of physical and spiritual resistance and ultimately led to the ending of transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans and slavery itself in the British Empire. Please note the exhibition is open 7 days per week from the 10:30 a.m. in the morning to 4 p.m. during winter and to 5 p.m. in the summer, with the exception of a week from Tuesday, the 2nd of May. This evening, continuing on our resistance lecture series, we welcome Stella Dadzie, author and feminist historian, best known for The Heart of Race, Black Women's Life in Britain. She will be speaking to us about how women played a dynamic and distinctive female role in the development of a culture of resistance to slavery, and drawing some themes out from her latest book, A Kick in the Belly, Women, Slavery, and Resistance, which is published in 2020. Now joined by Stella Dadzie, who would like to. I'll pass it over on to you.
Thanks, Bimpe, and hello, everybody. As you can see, I've been through the wars lately, so I'm not going to speak to camera other than to just say I am here and I am live. And instead of seeing me, you'll be seeing some slides as I take you through my talk.
Fabulous. Thank you, Stella. Just note that if you do have any questions that you would like to ask, please note them all in the comment section, and we will be having a quick Q&A session at the end of Stella Dadzie's talk. So if you have any questions, put them in the comment section, and we will note them down for the end of the talk.
Thank you, Bimpe. I thought I'd start this evening by with the question that I'm most frequently asked about A Kick in the Belly, which is how I came by the title. It comes from a remark by the absentee slaveholder Monk Lewis, who kept a very detailed diary of his two visits to Jamaica in 1815 and 1817. And he said, I have not passed 6 months in Jamaica, and I've already found on one of my estates a woman who'd been kicked in the womb by a white bookkeeper, by which she was crippled herself. And on another of my estates, another woman who'd been kicked in the womb by another white bookkeeper, by which he'd crippled the child. My two estates are at the two extremities of the island, and I'm entitled to say from my own knowledge that white bookkeepers kick black women in the belly from one end of Jamaica to the other. For me, his observation provided a really powerful and vivid metaphor for the gendered brutality that was experienced by enslaved women. But it was also a metaphor for the way they responded, because black women kicked back at the institution of slavery in countless ways, both subtle and overt. And I really like to focus this evening on this kickback, because as my book set out to show, this is the history, or the herstory, if you like, that we're least likely to hear. It's a story of resistance, it's a story of resilience, and it fits very neatly into these the theme of these online talks. It's impossible to do justice to um, the story of enslaved women without putting it into a context. And I think the context for the book is that Black women have been very effectively airbrushed out of the picture. I've just got a few images on slide just to remind you of some of the sheroes who have been so completely forgotten, really. Up at the top of the left, we see Nanny of the Maroons, who I'm going to speak about shortly. Top middle, we've got Yais and Tewa, who was something like 60 years old when she led an army of 5,000 Ashanti warriors in the fight against British colonial expansion. Top right, we have a number of women who fought in the Second World War, Black women who are very rarely mentioned when we hear stories of who fought to defend British democracy. Lower left, we have Mary Seacole, who is as worthy of remembrance as Florence Nightingale. In the centre, we have Claudia Jones, who was a powerful fighter for justice in the 40s, died very young, but certainly needs to be and deserves to be remembered for her pioneer role in the civil rights struggles faced in this country by Black communities in this country. And on the bottom right, I've just put in a face which I hope everybody will recognise. It's the image of Breonna Taylor. We heard so much, didn't we, during lockdown about the murder of George Floyd, and I don't wish in any way to detract from the horror of what happened to him. But Breonna Taylor, perhaps because her death wasn't captured on camera, was almost forgotten in our efforts to demonstrate and protest against George Floyd's murder. So we're talking about a story of resistance, a story that quite often when we do encounter the narrative of slavery is usually told from a very male perspective. And if you look at the image on screen, as you'll see, when we think of the resistance put up by enslaved people, quite often we think of men setting fire to the cane fields or men taking up arms. It is very rarely that women are mentioned in that narrative. So I thought I'd just start with a couple of quotes which appear in the book and which will help to set the context for tonight's lecture. The first is from by the Jamaican historian Lucille Maturin Mayer, who said that slavery and the slave trade, with its crude levelling of sexual distinctions, meant that African women shared every inch of the man's spiritual and physical odyssey. A very eloquent quote, which again I think I will speak to again later on. And the second quote is by Harriet Jacobs, an African American woman formerly enslaved, who said that superadded to the burden common to all, women had wrongs and sufferings and mortifications peculiarly their own. And I think that speaks to the fact that the experience of enslavement was very specific for women. And it's really important when we talk about slavery that we don't just generalize, but we recognize that women encountered a very gendered experience of barbarity and brutality. One of my endeavours when I wrote A Kick in the Belly was to avoid a narrative of victimhood. Very often the story is told of women who were used and abused on the coffle line, who were branded and abused um, um, on the Middle Passage, and again um, continued to be abused both by slaveholders and by men on the plantation. But I wanted to tell a different story, and the story I set out to tell doesn't begin on the plantations or, on a tight packed, disease ridden ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It actually starts long before European encroachment on a diverse and sprawling continent that was home to a wide range of cultures and socio-economic practices. Um, Everything from isolated hunter-gatherer communities to thriving kingdoms that had risen to power, often by means of huge armies with exceptional military prowess, and typically reliant on the enforced labour of prisoners of war. But it was a continent on which women, like women everywhere, um, could be subjected to gendered violence and abuse. And, I don't want to paint a romantic or idealized picture of pre colonial Africa, and nor would I want to deny the complex and diverse roles women could play. But it is important for us to remember that it was a continent on which women and, in fact, motherhood was um, given a certain degree of deference. And it was a continent where women played a very active and sometimes central role in communal survival strategies. And above all, it was a continent where women acquired and had acquired, by the time that slavery kicked off, a very long-standing reputation for their military prowess, where they could rise to great power as queens and matriarchs and lead huge armies or rule vast kingdoms. And I'm thinking here of the women of Dahomey, who you see on your screen, 8,000 of whom are known to have dominated the court and whose notoriety as fearless and ruthless fighters has been immortalized to this day. And I'm thinking in particular of Viola Davis in The Woman King, which many of you may have seen. I'm also thinking of women like Queen Nzinga, Anna Nzinga, who was a flea in the ear of the Portuguese for her throughout her 30-year rule, and countless others, some of whom have been lost to history. Um, but what is important about this is that whatever their background, women had the opportunity to rise up through the society. Um, I think it's fair to say that then, as now, African women can claim a checkered and far from perfect past, and it was determined as much by their class and social status rather as their gender and their race. But whatever their background, what is indisputable is that African women and girls who were sold or kidnapped to be shackled and transported away by European slavers would have been steeped in an understanding of their own potential and an understanding of what it meant to be a woman within their own context. And I'm going to quote Lucille Mayer again because she put it so eloquently. She said, "If indeed, as it has been argued, their ancient culture was the shield which frustrated European efforts to dehumanize Africans through servitude, it can also be argued that it was the African woman's perception of herself within that culture which accompanied her across the Middle Passage and which helped to preserve her from total defeminization in the New World. Now, this context is really important because when African women made that perilous journey across the Atlantic, and found themselves immersed in the living nightmare that was enslavement, these women came equipped with a really strong sense of self and role that even the cruelest of slave masters found it impossible to extinguish. And it's that sense of self and agency that underpins not only early descriptions by Europeans of their encounters with African women and enslaved women, but also the story of slavery itself from the coffle line onwards through into the plantation and beyond. And I'm reminded here of images that you can see on your screen, women who were cruelly punished for their refusal to comply with the sexual demands of their captors, women who chose death rather than bondage by throwing themselves headlong into the sea, and the mostly unnamed women whose furtive observations of their captors' routines and the location of the crew's armories as they wandered around on deck contributed to the known 485 uprisings that occurred on board nearly 1 in 10 of the slave ships that crossed the Atlantic. These women somehow found the strength to cling to the vestiges of their language, their belief systems, and their culture, and that enabled them to survive a lifetime of backbreaking toll in the brave yet brutal new world in which they were forcibly transported. And they may have arrived naked on the shores of the Americas, but they brought with them a treasure chest of skills, beliefs, and cultural weapons that not only ensured their survival, but were passed on to future generations. So effectively, we can see the vestiges of their efforts to this very day. As I said earlier, their acts of resistance were both subtle and overt, and nowhere is this more evident than in the experience of women who worked in the house. Could you just go back a slide, Kate? I'm thinking of women like Nanny Grigg, who literally taught herself to read over her master's shoulder, but used what she had learnt to incite her fellow enslaved on the plantation to rebel and rise up. And although the rebellion I'm referring to is known as Bussa's Rebellion, took place in Barbados in 1816, it might just as well be referred to as Nanny Grigg's Rebellion, for she too played a key role. So the image or the stereotype quite often that we have of domestic slaves who had an easier time of it because they worked in the great house um, is countered by stories like this one and the many others that abound of women who literally watched, listened, and bided their time. Um, and nowhere is the experience of domestic enslaved women more poignant than in the story of Mary Prince, of course, um, whose narrative of her life as an enslaved woman, an enslaved domestic, shows quite clearly that quite often their proximity to their enslavers meant that they experienced some pretty brutal treatment. As I state in my book, enslaved women found ways of fighting back that really beggar belief. Whether they were responding to the horrendous conditions of plantation life or the vagaries of their captors, or indeed the peculiar burdens of their sex, as it was referred to, their collective sanity really did rely on a subversive adaptation of the values and cultures they'd smuggled with them naked from different parts of Africa. And of course, I'm including in this not just um, the overt acts of subversion, such as you see here, but also the cultural subversion, the music, the storytelling, the preparation of food, the administering of medicines, um, fixing of hair, birthing and naming rites, or rituals for burying their dead. All of these cultural continuities ensured that the lives of chattel slaves retained meaning and purpose. And I suppose my argument is that this sense of self gave rise to a sense of agency, so that over time, both their subtle acts of insubordination and their conscious acts of rebellion came to undermine the very fabric of enslavement and slavery. Now, when I was on my quest to unearth the realities of these women's lives, I came across some quite surprising revelations. For example, contrary to the stereotype of a male-dominated workforce, there's really a wealth of statistical evidence to suggest that it was women, not men, who formed the bulk of the field gangs and performed the most laborious and backbreaking tasks on the plantation, the sugar plantations of Jamaica, Barbados, Grenada, and other sugar producing islands across the West Indies. And like men, they endured unspeakable conditions, including a woefully inadequate diet, sometimes less than 500 calories a day, and a serious lack of medical care, which resulted in a high incidence of physical deformity and premature death. But in the case of women, of course, it led to menstrual and gynecological disorders as well. Um, and of course, the sheer number of enslaved meant that they lived in a climate of slaveholder paranoia. And it's clear that the relentless punishments they were subjected to, the whippings, the amputations, the torture, the brandings, were meted out to men and women alike, with or without provocation. And of course, women did face the added threat of rape and casual sexual abuse. Now, I mention these grim realities simply to remind you of the context. As I said earlier, my focus tonight is more on how they resisted these realities, but I do feel that it's impossible to understand the courage it took to fight back unless we have a sense of the risks involved and the cruel fate that awaited those who were caught and punished. Um, and the truth is, enslaved women did find ways to resist, both overt and surreptitious, that drove their masters to distraction. We know this not just from plantation lists, punishment lists, and court records, but also from letters and diaries. The letters and diaries of the men who sought to repress them, and occasionally women too. And it was often actually in the banal day to day management of the plantation that opportunities for disruption and subversion were located. Monk Lewis, who I referred to earlier, who incidentally was accused by his peers of being too benign towards his slaves, he despaired of a housemaid who point blank refused to open the shutters correctly, despite constant reminders. Now, if you look at that act in isolation, it seems like a small act in the scheme of things. But the reality offers intriguing evidence of a young woman seizing agency where she could. And Monk Lewis was also exasperated by a petticoat rebellion, as he referred to it, when a group of his field women downed tools and refused to work despite angry threats and monetary enticements. And references like these provide just a tiny glimpse of women's consistently subversive behaviour, which ranged from small, mundane acts right through to murder, escape, and outright rebellion. Perhaps the most famous of these is Nanny of the Maroons. I don't know if you've got a slide of Nanny somewhere further down. But yes, Nanny was a fierce woman whose reputation for leadership of the Maroons has meant that she has been remembered through history. Her role was both spiritual and tactical, and it was very firmly grounded in the tradition of the Ashanti warrior priestess. Her guerrilla forces up in the Blue Mountains of Jamaica were literally prepared to fight to the death to defend their right to self-determination. And their tactics were so successful that after years of constant war, the British had no choice but to sue for peace. And the treaty signed in 1739, I think it was, not only guaranteed their autonomy, but included an offer of 500 acres of land for Nanny and her followers. And to this day, Nanny's grave is tended and revered. A similar role was played by a woman dubbed Cuba, Queen of Kingston, who was discovered sitting in state under a canopy with a robe around her shoulders and a crown on her head, enjoining her fellow captives to rise up and rebel during Tacky's rebellion in 1760 in Jamaica. She was deported for incitement initially, and um, her story beggars belief because somehow she managed to persuade the captain of the ship she was on to let her off on the leeward side of the island, from where she rejoined the rebels. And we know that she did this because surviving records speak of how she was recaptured months later and finally executed. Um, I think what's important to remember is that so many names have been lost to us. And when we think about women like Nanny and Cuba, what we need to remember is that they represent countless unnamed women who were prepared to risk all in their quest for freedom. I'll just mention one other woman, Sabrina Park, who was tried and sentenced to death for smothering her 3-month-old baby. And when she came down the steps of the courthouse, she was heard to say that she had worked enough for Buckra already and would not be plagued to raise her child to work for white people. And I think her mindset is completely unambiguous. She knew intrinsically that her role as breeder of the next generation of enslaved people was absolutely central to the survival of the institution of slavery. Now, I have to pay tribute to the work of historians like Michael Creighton, Richard Sheraton, Hilary Beckles, Lucille Mayer, I've mentioned already, Olive Senior, Barbara Bush. There are a number of historians in this field who have delved deeply into the records and the surviving papers and looked at the demographic data, etc. And what that means is that we now have access to and a growing raft of evidence that suggests that a significant number of women chose to scupper their owner's project. And as early as 1746, a governor of Jamaica called Edward Trelawney was insisting that, and I quote, what contributes chiefly to there being so few children among the English Negroes is the practice of wenches in procuring abortions. 3/4 of a century later, Monk Lewis was equally perplexed and frustrated by the dismal failure of his efforts to entice the women he owned to give birth. And I quote, he said, among upwards of 330 Negroes and with a greater number of females than men, in spite of all indulgences and inducements, not more than 12 or 13 children have been added annually to the lists. Now, infanticide, as I referred to earlier in Sabrina's case, would have been a very desperate choice. I think you'll agree. But most women seem to have used prolonged weaning, or their knowledge of natural herbs and flora and fauna, which they use as abortants to avoid unwanted pregnancies. And you'll have seen earlier the quote, um, chickens who won't lay eggs. This was a quote by Monk Lewis in response to the situation he encountered when he said, I really do think that the women could give birth at will if they chose to, and they're rather like chickens or hens on shipboard who refuse to lay eggs because they do not like their circumstances. There's absolutely no doubt from the data that as soon as the prospect of freedom loomed on the horizon, the birth rate began to shoot up. And you see this right across the British West Indies, despite the closure of laying in houses and the mass exodus of bookkeepers and overseas seers and plantation doctors. On some islands, Montserrat as an example, there was a population increase of something like 9.5% in a space of 3 years. And we see the same kind of huge swell in the population in places like Jamaica, St. Kitts, Dominica, and other islands. As I said, it's almost as if women finally gave themselves permission to give birth. The vast majority of enslaved women who resisted will remain anonymous. That's undoubtedly the case. But I think my argument would be that for every woman we can name, there are many, many others whose contribution to the downfall of slavery was important. And women like Cuba, Nanny, and Sabrina are very unlikely to have been unique. They've barely survived the historical whitewash, haven't they? Yet those we know of played a really important role in undermining the institution of slavery. And I say this because we tend, when we think of abolition, to think of names like William Wordsworth um, and Thomas Clarkson. And I'm not in any way wishing to detract from their contribution, but I think quite often what is overlooked in the discussion about abolition is the agency of enslaved people themselves. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I think probably I'm going to just begin to round up. Um, I did wanted to say something about why this story is so important. Um, I've met some people who say, "Oh, slavery. Why do you want to talk about slavery? Why don't you let sleeping dogs lie?" But I think it is important that we recall these stories and remember that slavery is far from over. The horrors of the Middle Passage are echoed in contemporary stories of African women and girls staggering across the Sahara, suffering rape and abuse in their desperation to escape the horrors in their homelands, the horrors of war poverty, and of course the effects of climate change. And I feel that the enduring power of this historical resistance resonates because that story is far from over. Um, we are living in a world where we're faced, I believe, with growing xenophobia and ongoing structural inequalities and shrinking resources, and all kinds of effects that we're beginning to see as a result of climate change. But it does help, doesn't it, to be reminded that throughout history, even in the most hopeless of circumstances, people have found ways to hold on to their humanity, to seize their whatever agency they could, and to fight back. And personally, I'm heartened by the knowledge that Black women have such a proud history. They certainly continue to guide and inspire me. And I do hope that those of you who've been listening tonight will feel inspired by their example too. So let me just finish um, so that you have time to ask questions, etc., by thanking you for this opportunity to share my thoughts, apologising again for not being visible on screen, and just saying that I hope, if nothing else, you'll find time to read the book and be encouraged to delve deeper into what I feel are some very inspirational stories of enslaved women's resilience. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Stella Dadzie. Thank you. That was very informative. And I've got some questions, and I'm sure there are others who have some questions. So if you do have any questions, please do put them in the comment section, and I will pass them. I will ask Stella, and she'll do her best to answer them. I've got some questions. Are you okay now? Do you need to get a drink or something, Stella? Are you good to
No, I'm
go?
fine. I'm just wondering whether I should just come back on screen
It's up to
because I know,
you.
yeah, I'm pressing. Yeah, there you go. People can see me and they'll just have to see me with my one eye.
You look great. You look great. That was amazing. I've read the book and I very much enjoyed the book, and I loved how conversational the book was. It just felt like a conversation, and it made it so much easier for me to understand what all the important stuff in the book. I was thinking, was that intentional because of the context that the subject matter we were dealing with, or was that something just came through the writing
No,
process?
it was absolutely intentional. I've, if you know anything about the stuff I've written over the years, I'm an absolute champion of accessibility. I really can't see the point of of delving into this history if the conversation is confined to a bunch of academics. So it was very much my intention, excuse me, to um, present people with an accessible story that you didn't need a university degree to be able to unravel. Um, and the same was true, I think, of the heart of the race. It is so important, isn't it, that we have a real conversation about our past and our history. And that was one of my hopes. So thank you for that feedback, because it really is important to me that anyone can pick up the book and read it, and that you don't need a history degree to get it.
Oh, fabulous. No, I really like books for the conversation because I feel like I'm in it and I'm understanding a
Yeah,
bit better.
yeah.
So that was great. And I'm glad to hear that that was also intentional, because it felt very, very intentional, like it was doing something
Yeah,
to
yeah.
make me
I'm
understand.
also a great stickler for oral history.
Oh,
I really think it's important that we hear the story from, from people's own mouths. And I think one of the challenges of writing this particular history, of course, is that most of the records that have been left to us come from the enslavers rather than the enslaved. There's very few first person records other than Equiano and Mary Prince and a few others who we could name. where we get a first person account of the experience. So really one of the challenges of writing the book was to what I refer to as read the music behind the words. You know, I referred in my talk to Monk Lewis, and if you read his diary at face value, we encounter a man who was very frustrated by some pretty recalcitrant um, people who he happened to own. But if you read behind his words, what you see is you know the smile playing on the lips of the girl who refused to open the blinds. Doesn't matter what he said. Now, anyone who's lived in a hot country knows how important it is to have the blinds open on one side and closed on the other, and vice versa, depending on where the sun is. But this woman refused to do it, and you know that she didn't do it because she was stupid. You know that she did that because she was playing with him. Um, so stories like that just make me chuckle, and they make me chuckle because I recognise her. You know, I know women like that, and I think we all do.
Oh, thank you so much. No, I agree. I've got another question for you. So you used a lot of primary sources in the book, which is great because often those are really hard to source and really hard to find. But what surprised you the most when uncovering the history?
It goes back a long way because I started my research in the mid '80s. Um, and as I said when I was speaking, you know, a lot of those primary sources weren't found by me, they were
Mm,
found by other historians.
yeah.
So I should say that up front. But what surprised me most, I think, was the story I mentioned about how women used the little knowledge they had retained of flora and fauna and so on to mount such a consistent resistance to being bred and used like cattle, you know, to breed the next generation of slaves. I think that is a really powerful story. And, you know, I'm not suggesting that every woman who chose that route did so because she was consciously um, trying to undermine the institution, nor am I suggesting that, you know, some women weren't acting out of desperation. But I think the data does speak for itself, you know, and you see it across across the whole of the West Indies, not just on the British West Indian Islands, but also in the French colonies as well. And it's interesting because if you know anything about enslavement on the American continent, you see quite a different picture. So there's a very specific um, story here around how women faced encountering, the sugar plantations, chose to resist.
Sorry, I just realized I was muted. But thank you. That was from Park. Hopefully that answered that question. Um, I've got another question for you. So you do mention Breonna Taylor at the start of your talk, and I'm aware. Well, I mean, we all are aware about how Black Lives Matter movement has really pushed a much needed attention to the darker side of the empire. And books like A Kick in the Belly is such a great book to start the conversation, but or further the conversations has already been started a long time ago. But what is the next direction organization? What is the direction organizations or you know um, should be taken in order to ensure that this conversation continues to happen in the relevant spaces?
Um, I don't see myself as a guru, Bimpy. I'm probably as unsure as you are where this is all headed. But what I do know is I've reached an age where I've seen these issues come and go. I lived through civil rights. Black Lives Matter to me was a continuation of that, and I do really see our struggle as something that is on a continuum, um, and is ongoing and never ending in a way. We will constantly have to, keep this up. Um, but in terms of Black Lives Matter, and I've said this before and I'm on record as saying it, I think it is important that we look beyond the experiences of Black communities in the relatively privileged Western societies in which we live, and remember that Black Lives Matter wherever they are. And we only have to look at the situation developing now in Sudan, or at the growing number of migrants. There are just so many horrors that people on the African continent are facing now, that if we are genuinely outraged and impassioned by the story of historical slavery, we have to be mobilizing and finding ways of challenging some of those scenarios, those contemporary scenarios that we're encountering today. So I think if we're to go anywhere useful soon, it will be by embracing that challenge and making sure that we, who have the relative privilege to be able to speak out, do so on behalf, or I shouldn't say on behalf of us, in um, solidarity with those who don't.
Thank you. I'm just scrolling through. There has been many calls for, for example, the Prime Minister, or to take accountability for the actions, and apologize for, you know, slavery, for their own slavery, for Britain's own slavery. I'm just curious, what's your thoughts on it? Do you think, earlier on today was a Prime Minister question where an MP did ask to apologise, and there was a direct answer, which was no. How important do you think we need this apology, or do you think actually focusing more on the information out there and sharing that knowledge is where we should be focusing our efforts on?
Um, to be honest with you, Bimpy, I'm not too interested in his apologies. To me, those are empty words. It's and very, very late in the day, really, considering that slavery was officially abolished in 1834. It
Mm,
took them some time, didn't it? I'm far more interested in what they're going to do to make reparation
mm,
for the legacies of enslavement, which, as I say, we continue to live with. The real target of their um, concern should be on the millions of people who continue to live in poverty, who continue to be denied access to education and decent health care and housing. Those are the very real, tangible effects of slavery, and you can see it reproduced not just um, in the West Indies, but also um, in the countries whose populations were depleted and whose resources were and continue to be stolen. So, you can say sorry as much as you like, can't you? Really, um, an apology is only as good as what you do to make recompense. And I think you don't have to be too imaginative, do you, to come up with some real, meaningful ways of doing that. Personally, I think all debt should be abolished. Maybe
mm,
that sounds a bit radical, but people continue to pay back um, monies that were borrowed that actually um, were taken from them. Um, if you think of the resources that were stolen. So there are many practical ways that if our Prime Minister really wanted to apologise, he could begin to find ways of redressing.
Thank you so much for that. In many ways, I do share your thoughts on that. Um, I am so there's been many so what brilliantly done with the book is putting women at the forefront and showing how like so many stories untold about what they did and how they did it, but we have all the male at the center, always there. And this book is just shows that so many women were present, like frontline, present, and very impactful in so many ways. But their stories continue to be pushed aside or overlooked. Um, what what I was just curious, what can we do? What can organizations do? Because it's very hard to implement this knowledge into the national curriculum for children, students to be able to have access to it. What can organizations do to ensure that this knowledge continues to be shared with the right people, with students, with even not students, but like elderly people who have been denied this history, this important part of history?
Mhm. It shouldn't be that difficult, really, should it? I'm personally a bit fed up with Black History Month being the only platform for showcasing these stories. I think it should be integrated across the curriculum and be naturally arising in the stories we tell. Um, and I've worked for many years with teachers on that very project. So I personally think it's more about political will than access to information because we can all Google just about anything now. And these stories are accessible and they're out there and they're available. So, yeah, I think people have to stop agonizing about how difficult it is and just get on and do it. Um, I do think it's beginning to happen. I've been working quite closely with um, a number of organisations across the heritage sector, looking at how we can rebalance the stories that are told in our museums. Um, and I think, as I say, it is beginning to happen. Slowly, slowly, these stories are beginning to be told and it's important that they are. So it's a combined effort, isn't it? It's what we teach our own children in our homes, the learning we expose them to, and encourage them to access. It's about training teachers so that they feel confident to address these issues in the classroom. And I'm not just talking about school teachers, university lecturers and college lecturers have a similar challenge. And it's about our heritage sector acknowledging the roots of its collections and its stately homes and so on, and at least beginning to make recompense by telling a more nuanced story of how that wealth was acquired, how those collections were acquired, and um, trying to emphasize the humanity of the people from whom they were taken.
Thank you very much. I've got one final question for you because I realize we're running out of time. Are there any other reading recommendations that you have, either nonfiction or fiction, that will help us along learning more about resistance in slavery?
Oh, I'm often asked that question. There's so much out there. I'm a prolific reader, but I think if I'm thinking off the top of my head, a good sister read to
Yeah.
this to a kick in the belly, and a far more eloquent book than I could ever write is Marlon James's Book of Night Women, which tells a really powerful story of female um, resistance to enslavement. And if anybody ever suggests that a man can't put himself in women's shoes and write um, from that perspective, I just defy them to read this book and you know, insist on that because he really has done a brilliant job, I think, of getting into the heads and understanding the mindset of feisty, resilient women.
And on that, we're going to end on that note. Thank you so much, Stella Dadzie, on this amazing, informative evening. I feel inspired, and I'm sure everyone joining us on this as well has learned something about women and how they resisted. We do have, you can explore our exhibition further. It also looks at resistance, so it's open for everyone to come and see. Apart from the second of May, the week of the 2nd of May. But please do come and visit our exhibition and help us spread it to your friends and family. It's a great exhibition with so many people involved. Have expressed so much about their work being featured on our exhibition. So it's the one for people to see to continue our topic on resistance. We also have many more, a lecture coming up, another talk coming up. So do check our website for all the full details. I'm running out of time, but you can all check further details on Fulham Palace website for all our lectures, our talks, and more about our exhibition. Thank you again, once Stella Dadzie. We appreciate
Thank you, Bimpe, and thank you everyone for listening. I'm sorry, it wasn't a good look tonight, but I'm
No, you
sorry
look great.
I had to appear like this. Okay,
It's great.
thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Goodbye.
And goodbye, everyone.